Alrighty, so I think that we will go ahead and get started. Hello everyone. My name is Danielle. I'm the Public Programs and Visitor Services Manager at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. And welcome to our first session of Connect260. This is a virtual lecture series based on our special exhibition that's going to be opening June 14th, called What the House Saw, 260 Years of Stories from the Morris-Jumel Collection and Community. So we're really excited for this first May session. And this theme is going to be settling between the rivers, talking about the colonial and pre-colonial era of the mansion and the land that the mansion stands on. And we have a really, really awesome guest who's been working with some of the objects from our archaeological excavations. And he will be talking a little bit more about that. But without further ado, about the mansion, if this is your first time joining us for a program today, the Morris-Jumel Mansion is celebrating 260 years ago. So in 1765, the mansion was built, and it is the oldest remaining house in Manhattan. It is listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and that was done in the 60s. And it was designated an individual landmark in 1967 and an interior landmark in 1975 by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. It is built on the ancestral land of the Lenape people and was likely built and funded using enslaved labor. It was also used as George Washington's headquarters in 1776, and it housed Eliza Jamel, former Vice President Aaron Burr, and Anne Northup, who was the wife of Solomon Northup, who wrote 12 Years a Slave, and so many more other sort of like little pathways that our history goes down in terms of our residents. And it also was the place that inspired Lin-Manuel Miranda, who wrote parts of his hit musical Hamilton at the Morris-Jumel Mansion, sitting in Aaron Burr's bed chamber. So just a few housekeeping updates as well before we get into the super, super fun stuff for today. On June 14th, we have our monthly Family and Community Day. That is from 1 to 3 p.m. at the mansion, totally free, no registration required. Then on June 18th, we have another Connect260, which is going to be about the theme Building a New Nation. And this will focus on the Revolutionary War and the early American period of the brand new country. Then on June 21st, we have a summer picnic concert in Roger Morris Park, so the park right outside the mansion, with the Washington Heights Chamber Orchestra. That was a hit last year if you had attended by chance our Bridgerton concert in the park with them. So it's going to be sort of an encore of the fun vibes from that one. And then on July 18th, we have something that I am super excited for, which is our Tavern Night fundraiser. It's highlighting a really little known period of the mansion's history where we were a tavern after the Revolutionary War. And it's going to be really fun. We have a bunch of fun sponsors, and tickets are on sale online now. And it goes to supporting a really good cause, in my opinion, though I may be a little biased. But we also have our summer hours beginning on May 27th. So we're open at 1 p.m. on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, in addition to our regular hours of 1 p.m. on Thursdays and then 11 a.m. Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And then, like I mentioned, opening June 14th is our brand new special exhibition. What the House Saw, 260 Years of Stories from the Morris-Jumel Mansion Collection and Community. It's going to be really great. And I hope you'll come out and check it out. But now on to the good stuff. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Matthew Reilly. And I'll read off his bio and then he'll kind of come and take the reins in just a few seconds. But Dr. Matthew C. Reilly is an associate professor of anthropology and interdisciplinary programs at the City College of New York and co-subfield coordinator for archaeology at the CUNY Graduate Center. He currently directs archaeological research in Barbados and with the Back-to-Africa Heritage and Archaeology project in Liberia. His work explores issues of race, colonialism, heritage, slavery, sovereignty, and freedom in the Caribbean and West Africa. In addition to multiple peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, he's the co-editor of Pre-Colonial and Post-Contact Archaeology in Barbados, Past, Present, and Future Research Directions, and author of Archaeology Below the Cliff, Race, Class, and Redlegs in Barbadian Sugar Society. So we have Dr. Reilly here today. But before we get into the really good stuff and I turn over the reins, we'll talk a little bit about how to submit questions. So you have a Q&A feature on this Zoom webinar that allows you to submit questions. So Dr. Reilly is going to take over the lecture portion of this. He'll lecture for about 30 minutes, but continue to throw those questions in the chat as they come to you, even if it's during the lecture. And then after that, we'll have about 30 minutes of discussion for all of the great questions that you all think up. So be sure to use the Q&A portion of the chat, and I am going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Danielle. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here with you all virtually. So thanks so much for joining me this evening, a very cold and rainy evening. But I know sometimes the sports and the history crowd don't often overlap. But for those of you, if I'm keeping you from Knicks game 1 of the Eastern Conference Finals, I will try to keep things to the hour time slot that we have. So hopefully now you can all see my slides. If there are any issues, as Danielle mentioned, please feel free to use that hand raise function or throw some questions into the chat. I try to do my best to monitor during the talk, but happy to address anything in depth once I wrap up. So thank you again for the kind invitation and introduction to the Morris-Jumel Mansion. It's been a real pleasure to work with staff members over the last several months, and I'll get into those details in just a moment. But for those of you who are just hearing my introduction, you may be thinking, what is this guy doing here to talk to us about the archaeology of indigenous populations and landscapes at the Morris-Jumel Mansion? And as Danielle mentioned, most of my archaeological career has been spent working on issues of colonialism, slavery, freedom in the Caribbean and West Africa. And you can see some photos here of the work that I do that's primarily around the theme of the African diaspora. And while these two projects are ongoing, over the last few years, one of the ways in which I was trained was to make sure that I engaged locally with how archaeology can have an impact on how we understand the past and our contemporary landscapes and how they intersect. So I was really excited when about maybe over 2 years ago now, or a year and a half ago, I was on sabbatical and I was approached by the dean of our architecture school at City College, who was connected with an alum of City College of New York, who now sits on the board for Morris-Jumel Mansion, and by the name of Wayne Benjamin. And I was thrilled to see that he's one of our participants here this evening. So it's thanks to Wayne that I learned a little bit more about the Morris-Jumel Mansion. He invited me for the first time to see the property. And we began to think about how City College might be able to get involved with what's going on at the mansion, including some of those preparations for what Danielle was just discussing about Connect260, the 260th anniversary of the actual residence itself. And amazingly, for all that is known historically about this space, what we're able to offer as archaeologists is even more time depth through the forum or through the medium of material culture. So over the course of the next 30 minutes or so, what I'd really like to do is explore what we know materially about this landscape, not just the Morris-Jumel property, but Indigenous New York in kind of a broader stretch from the earliest human habitation, roughly around 9 to 10,000 years ago, all the way up to and partially through the arrival of European and Africans to this particular space. So we'll try to do kind of a macro scale overview and then get down to the nitty gritty with some actual artifacts that were excavated from the property. So I look forward to discussing where this research has been taking me over the last few years. So as I mentioned, it's a real honor and pleasure to be able to work at a space like the Morris-Jumel Mansion. But it's also quite a challenge because so much is known about this space historically. The oldest residence in New York City with a storied past in so many different dimensions. You can find that on the website, also while visiting the property, of course. And now, so for the challenge here is to try to figure out what narratives are often left out of this story or left out of the archive when we don't rely on the written word. And this is where archaeology can assist in a lot of really productive and illuminating ways. So what I plan to do today, again, is to give an overview of the Lenape occupation of this space leading up to colonial contact and what we can potentially say materially about those who called this place home and their persistence on the landscape all the way through the colonial period and into independence. So you can see here an artist's rendering of perhaps what this landscape may have looked like prior to European colonization. And then on the left-hand side of the screen, a more social or cultural map of the Lenape people stretching from what is now upstate New York all the way down into what is now Delaware. The Lenape peoples, also known as the Delaware. And when I would usually be giving a talk related to archaeological work, I would start with an indigenous land acknowledgement. But importantly, what we're going to be discussing today throughout this talk is in and of itself an acknowledgement of their presence in the past and continued presence into the present. So it's something that's going to be underlying the entire talk all the way through. So it's something important to keep in mind. So before I get going with what's known archaeologically, I should note that since most of my career was spent in the Caribbean and West Africa, I'm relatively new to New York City archaeology. And thankfully, I'm standing on some pretty big shoulders to help me out in terms of learning what's been researched archaeologically in this incredible city. And you're looking at two of the best resources. So for those of you who would like to learn a little bit more about how archaeology contributes to what we know about our city's past, I highly recommend these two excellent books. On the right is one of the first archaeological overviews of New York City, which is Unearthing Gotham by Anne-Marie Cantwell and my own predecessor at City College, Diana Wall. And then on the left, a very recent publication by Nan Rothschild, Amanda Sutphin, Arthur Bancroft, and Jessica McLean called Buried Beneath the City, An Archaeological History of New York. Two incredible resources that will take you back to the earliest human occupation all the way up to the present. And they're also filled with incredible figures and images of actual excavations and all the pretty artifacts that have been found all across the 5 boroughs. I should also mention that the authors of the book on the left, many of them are employed or had been employed by the New York City Archaeological Repository, which is an incredible space right in the middle of Manhattan in Rockefeller Center that is home to millions of archaeological artifacts that have been excavated from sites across the 5 boroughs. So some of the material from some of the sites that I'll be mentioning are housed here, but it's an incredible space to explore the city's deep past, including the rich history from the colonial period. You can see some of those artifacts featured on the bottom of your screen. So I just wanted to throw out some of those resources before we get started. So as I mentioned, on the top here, you can see this artist's rendering of what this landscape may have looked like when the Lenape called it home prior to European colonization. And it's hard to imagine what this space not only looked like, but how it was experienced by indigenous peoples, especially when we think of New York City as this incredibly developed cosmopolitan metropolis that we know of it in the 21st century. But importantly, when we think about this space, we shouldn't necessarily assume kind of this pre-colonization, one with nature or environmental determinism, and then a post-contact rise of development and European colonization. And what I mean by this is it's often easy to assume that prior to European colonization, there was an America that was home to indigenous populations who were living at one with nature, whose environment determined the kind of lifeways that they would have had. And to dispel this kind of myth, the authors of that book that I mentioned, Buried Beneath the City, argue here in this quote that the environment has influenced the choices people make about where and how to live. And in turn, people have shaped environmental characteristics to support their way of life. And that was true 9,000 years ago, just as it is today. And you can see here at the bottom of the slide, the contemporary environmental conditions we now experience largely settled around 5,000 years ago. But that doesn't mean that the environment hasn't changed and that peoples haven't changed it and been changed by it over the last several thousands of years. So whether we're talking about the Lenape, the Dutch, African peoples, English colonists, or contemporary New Yorkers, there's a very complex relationship between the environment and the societies that call the space home. Archaeologically, if we're trying to think about the earliest occupation of this space, we tend to rely on a very broad chronology to think about how we tell time through archaeological artifacts. And you can see that timeline represented here on the top portion of your screen, where archaeologists like to break things down into three basic periods: that of the Paleo-Indian, that of the Archaic, and then the latter period before leading up to colonization and through colonization, I should mention, is the woodland. Now, importantly, while Morris-Jumel is celebrating 260 years, which is an incredibly long period of time, for archaeology in this space, we're talking about over 10,000 years of human occupation. And compared to what we know of the last 260 years, we know relatively little if we're talking about that larger stretch of thousands of years. But importantly, we do have artifactual evidence suggesting human occupation of this space going back around 10,000 years ago with the rise of a geological epoch called the Holocene. This artifact that you see pictured here is known archaeologically as a Clovis or Folsom Point, and one of these was actually uncovered on Staten Island. So we don't have the time depth of 10,000 years ago within the immediate area of Morris-Jumel, but the five boroughs absolutely was inhabited by indigenous peoples going back roughly 10,000 years. And once we get into the Archaic period, there's a lot more archaeological evidence for the complexity of stone tool making. And in fact, on the bottom left, you can see how archaeologists often tell time using lithic technology, the stone tools that represent different periods going from the Paleo-Indian all the way through the woodland period. So stone tools are incredibly important for understanding the pre-colonization past, and it's something I'm going to come back to when we refer to the artifacts that were actually unearthed at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. And then lastly, for the woodland period, you can see other forms of material culture show up in the archaeological record, namely some ceramic technologies, which also tell us a lot more about subsistence strategies and what people were eating and putting on the table, so to speak, roughly 3,000 years ago. So this in many ways is how archaeologists use material culture to tell time, but I'm also going to be using my time today to try to deconstruct and make this a little more nuanced and complex. Because while artifacts do date to particular periods, they can often be used and reused at multiple points throughout a landscape's past. And that's certainly something that would have been true for the Morris-Jumel property, and something I'll come back to. But in terms of the broader landscape of the five boroughs, we do have incredible evidence of socially complex indigenous peoples calling this space home going back thousands of years. And in terms of how this is observed in the archaeological record, archaeologists weren't the first to document this. In fact, the Dutch and English during the colonial period did observe very large piles of maritime shells, which indicated ancient occupation by indigenous peoples. And very early on, semi-professional or amateur archaeologists began to excavate some of these sites in the early 20th century. This is what we refer to archaeologically as a midden or a trash heap. And on the top portion of your screen, you can see two of the earliest archaeologists working in New York City. And this photo was actually taken from Inwood, so northern Manhattan, right within the range of that Morris-Jumel property during the colonial period. And there are many sites throughout northern Manhattan that indicate a strong archaic and woodland presence of Lenape peoples. And it's during this period that we have more permanent settlements, whereas during the Paleo-Indian phase, Mostly we had hunter-gatherer tribes who were following herds across landscapes and rarely settling in place for long periods of time. Instead, we had more seasonal evidence of occupation. But here in the Archaic and into the Woodland period, we have permanent settlements, larger populations, agricultural practices, and material culture that becomes more complex and diverse across multiple archaeological sites, including in northern Manhattan. And you can see this represented across the indigenous landscape of the American Northeast throughout the Delaware or Lenape territories. And some of the artifacts you see pictured here on the right-hand side of your screen and the small exhibition you see on the bottom left are actually featured at the Museum of the State of New York in upstate in Albany. So we have a tremendous amount of archaeological material that's been generated that speaks to the complexity and longstanding relationship to this landscape of Lenape peoples going back thousands of years. And this is something that was not lost on the early colonists. And in fact, what you're looking at here is an artist's rendering of what one of these spaces would have looked like. This is painted in or drawn in the mid-19th century and housed, I believe, at the New York Historical Society. But it shows the complexity of indigenous settlements and their persistence through the arrival of colonists from the Netherlands and then later from England. And in fact, if you look at old maps of New York City, Wall Street itself was a physical wall where everything south was colonial territory. And you would have had settlements like the ones pictured here in territories like northern Manhattan well into the 17th and perhaps into the early 18th centuries. And that's something I'm going to come back to a little bit later through the archaeological evidence at the mansion. But lastly, before turning to the mansion itself, I should mention that while we're talking about indigenous presence thousands of years ago, in many ways, this presence is still with us, whether we acknowledge it or are aware of it on an everyday basis. So you're looking at my own home borough of Brooklyn here on the map. And while we don't have this for northern Manhattan, it's a really telling example of how the indigenous landscape itself is still with us. So many of the main thoroughfares in Brooklyn today were actually originally pathways that were created and maintained by indigenous peoples. So Flatbush Avenue, Fulton Street, and parts of Atlantic Avenue all were originally pathways that were carved by the Lenape. So important ways that we recognize the persistence of an indigenous presence here among us as New Yorkers. But getting to the mansion itself, as I mentioned earlier, things did change quite dramatically with the arrival of colonists and the building of the mansion 260 years ago. And so we know an awful lot about the actual property. We have an incredible amount of archival evidence as has been well researched by the staff and other organizations that are partnering with the Morris-Jumel Mansion. And the website is an incredible treasure trove for telling these narratives. And it's a similar experience to actually walk through the halls and learn about this detailed history. However, as I mentioned earlier, less is known about the archaeological presence of indigenous peoples. But thankfully, there are laws in the United States to help make sure that we protect our cultural resources archaeologically. And through those laws, like the law that you see pictured here, archaeology has taken place on the grounds of the Morris-Jumel Mansion. You're looking at here, you don't have to read the entire script here, but this is the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, specifically Section 106 of this particular act. And it's arguably the most far-reaching archaeological heritage protection law on the books around the world, indicating that if federal money or federal funds or federal permits are used for a particular project or development, you have to make sure that you're not going to destroy something of cultural significance. And this is where archaeologists come in. And this is exactly how the majority of archaeology takes place around our city from 1966 up until the present day. Some incredible discoveries have been made through this form of archaeology known as cultural resource management. Here you're looking at in the top right, the World Trade excavations, where they actually uncovered a Dutch ship. You're seeing them excavating the hull of that ship here on the top right. But other incredible sites have been found, including indigenous sites, as indicated by some of the stone tools on the bottom right. In fact, for those of you familiar, this is exactly how the African burial ground was rediscovered in Lower Manhattan back in 1991. So you can see here, not just miraculous finds like the hulls of 17th century ships, but the more human side of archaeology, the everyday items, like a personal shoe, a leather shoe that you can see on the bottom left. Thankfully, that was preserved in the archaeological record through a waterlogged environment, very swampy waterlogged space in lower Manhattan where it was excavated. And as mentioned, this is exactly how archaeology took place at the Morris-Jumel property. Here you're looking at the actual reports that were published after 3 of the projects that took place at the mansion. And importantly, this work took place for relatively mundane reasons. In some cases, you can read the actual titles here. On the far left, you can see that a new sprinkler system needed to be put in the mansion to avoid damage that could be done by fire. So anytime there are alterations to the landscape, specifically that might affect anything underground, archaeologists are brought in to make sure that there's nothing significant that's going to be damaged. And because we have incredible CRM archaeologists that continue to work in this city, all of this work was meticulously documented, and all of the artifacts that were unearthed were safely kept at the Morris-Jumel property. So here you're looking at reports from excavations in 1994, 2000, and 2005. And when I first started partnering with the Morris-Jumel Mansion, we recognized that the 1994 collection really needed some updating. After about 30 years, as you can imagine, some of the plastic bags were beginning to wear, some of the notes weren't entirely intact. So with the help of an intern named Mee Fitzgerald, who's still working with me in our lab, we've been rebagging and reanalyzing all of the artifacts that came through this particular excavation in 1994. And as mentioned, some of it's as mundane as a new pipe being put into the property. Some of these pipes ran right up against the sides of the house. And on the left, you can see a very detailed map of the mansion as it exists today, with the locations of where some of the excavation units were actually dug on the property. All very well documented, with hundreds of photos and detailed records of every item that was unearthed through this process. And what you're looking at here is one of the catalog numbers, or the information of one specific level of excavation. You can see the opening and closing depths, where this archaeologist was excavating at roughly 33 centimeters below the surface, and all of the artifacts that were found in the small, roughly 10 centimeter level of excavation. There are a couple of items that I'm going to come back to at the top, but I do want to point out the Native American artifact that you see identified here. Seemingly mundane and doesn't tell us a lot. It's one blocky fragment, gray chert, utilized 3.6 grams. So we have this notation, but what does it mean in terms of material culture? So looking at this report, working with the intern, whose name is Mee, the two of us sat down and tried to analyze these stone tools to try to figure out what they could tell us about Indigenous presence. So we thought about the material. In terms of what we can learn from these stone artifacts, these can be sources, and we can think through where the stone itself may have been coming from, which might tell us about trade and mobility. And in fact, some of the stone represented in this collection is not endemic to the New York City area. So it's very likely that we have representation of trade between throughout the Northeast and perhaps even into the mid-Atlantic. In terms of manufacturing techniques, we can start to indicate how certain tools were being made for daily use. In terms of daily use, we can think of the specific tasks that would have been important for Indigenous peoples. Some may have been scrapers, some may have been used for chopping, for butchering meat, for repairing household items, and some may have been combined or hafted onto another tool. And then finally, we also have to think about discard. Can we see use wear on these specific artifacts? And what does it tell us about where these artifacts were deposited? So on the right, we're not looking at any artifacts that were found archaeologically, but strong examples of the types of tools that have been found in the New York area. On the top right, you're looking at artifacts that are currently held by the New York State Archaeological Museum in Albany, as I mentioned. And then on the bottom right, this particular stone tool is made of obsidian. It's not anything that's local to New York City, and that's not where this artifact is coming from. But it does demonstrate a really important archaeological principle, because right in the center of that photo, you do see the stone tool, the two sharp edges on either side that would have been very useful as a multi-purpose tool. But surrounding the tool is all the debris of when the individual would have been making this particular stone tool. And this is what we refer to as debitage, or the flakes, the cast off material that falls by the wayside as stone tools are being produced. And we have lots of examples of these pieces of debitage from the 1994 collection. It doesn't look like much, but on the top left of your screen, you're seeing here what the entire artifact looks like. This might be a stone that you could kick along the road as you're walking down Broadway on a sunny day. But upon closer examination, which we did using a microscope in our archaeology lab, on the bottom right, you can see the sharpened edge that likely indicates that this particular piece flaked off the larger tool as it was being produced. So it takes fine scale analysis to make sure that we're dealing with a cultural artifact rather than a natural stone. And this is what we're working on at the moment, working with lithic experts around the city to try to identify the exact nature of these stone tools or the flakes therefrom and their time periods, or perhaps trying to help us date when they come from. And this is a particularly challenging endeavor, given what we know about the excavations that took place. So I've turned back to this catalog number that I referenced just a few slides ago. And you can see here, this chert artifact, which I just showed on the previous screen, wasn't alone in this particular deposition or this stratigraphic layer. Instead, you see pieces of plastic, red brick, mortar, coal, cinder, charcoal. These are all more modern artifacts associated with the last few hundred years, or in the case of plastic, the last 120 years or so. So what is an indigenous artifact doing in this particular deposit? We don't yet have clear answers, but we do know archaeologically that it's not uncommon for multiple time periods to be jumbled together if there's disturbance. If you remember earlier, some of these excavation units were placed right up against the house as they were installing pipes for sprinkler systems. So this could be an area that was heavily disturbed and modified as the house went through its construction phase or as it went through modifications over the last 260 years. This would have caused layers of indigenous material to be mixed up with the more recent historical material. And this isn't uncommon for archaeological sites around the city or around the country or around the world. Our job then is to try to understand how this would have happened depositionally and what we can say about the indigenous presence in New York at this particular time. And not only that, one thing I want to focus on here as I come to a close, as I mentioned, I do want to keep this to a half hour and leave plenty of time for conversation. The chronologies that we have for thinking about the indigenous past are very useful for categorizing and trying to understand the timeline of when people arrived and what happened over the last few thousand of years before colonial contact. But recently in the world of archaeology, there's been more of a concerted push to try to better understand the interactions of indigenous histories with that of African American histories. And you're seeing here an archaeologist by the name of Lindsay Montgomery, who very beautifully summarized this point in an article from 2022, noting that not just archaeologically, but in general, when we think about history, we often isolate the indigenous past from the more recent past. And that's why at many sites around the city and elsewhere, it's very common for us to tell the story of the indigenous past and then have a separate kind of chapter or explanation or narrative reserved for enslavement or the colonial period or the Revolutionary War. And it is important to understand these episodes as they transpired over the course of a long period of time. But archaeology is very unique. Because of the disturbed nature of the archaeological record, it jumbles up material culture in some cases, making it harder to separate those paths. And in some ways, this can be a really useful exercise for us as we try to better understand a very complicated landscape like the Morris-Jumel's property. And I think it's a really telling sign of how we can think through the complexity, not just of the last 260 years, but the last perhaps 9,000 years. And some of these artifacts are allowing us to do that piece by piece. And as mentioned, we're only at the early stages of this process. There are boxes and boxes of these artifacts at the mansion itself, and we're hoping to learn a little bit more about these artifacts as we continue to do this research. But importantly, as I close up here, one thing I do want to emphasize is that while we conduct this work, everything that we're going to be doing is going to be for community members. You're seeing here working with a PhD student named Leah Mullen Kling, who's pictured in the back here. This is one of our pilot programs for engaging with school children in the Washington Heights area. We welcomed in a school group, I believe it was last summer, to give an explanation of what archaeology is and what it can do to help our understanding of a space like the Morris-Jumel Mansion. And I hope to continue this program as we move forward and learn a lot more about the artifacts that were excavated from this space. Additionally, it's hoped that we can collaborate with members of the Lenape to try to better understand the significance of this material culture and what they'd like to know about their particular past connection to this landscape from the past to the present. And in terms of moving that forward as we close out, I did want to reference as we move the conversation of Connect260 into the period of the Revolutionary War, it is interesting to note that there are some really close connections to the work I've also been doing in Barbados. So for instance, you can see a map of New York, northern Manhattan, the area of the Morris-Jumel property from the late 18th century. I believe this is the John Randall map. And you can see the mansion if you're able to see my cursor here right in the middle. But if you look a little bit further to the north, you can also see one large and two smaller structures circled here. And indicated here in very small print, but if you look at the map closely, you can make it out. One is a stable house, one is an ice house, and one is a coal house. Each of these would have been spaces for laborers, perhaps enslaved, perhaps free people of color, perhaps indigenous, perhaps of European descent. And these spaces, two of them at least, are still on the property today, buried underground, but we don't know what may still exist of these archaeological features. And in conversation with the Morris-Jumel leadership and board, one idea that we floated is some non-invasive tests, including ground-penetrating radar, to see if any of these archaeological features are visible below the surface. So no excavations planned yet. I think that's important to note here. I don't plan to show up next week with a shovel hoping to dig up some artifactual treasures. But there are ways in which we can speak to the laboring history of this space going back prior to the Revolutionary War and afterwards. So as I mentioned earlier, the connections with my own work, it's significant to note that we're now teasing out family connections between the Morrises that built this property and then some of their own ancestors who actually arrived in Barbados first to establish plantations. Some of that family ended up in New Jersey, where they continued links to the West Indies. And it's likely, well, we haven't seemed to figure out exactly the relationship, but it could very well be the case that this Morris family similarly had Barbadian connections. And what would that do for the creation of space? What kind of plantation organization or spatial organization would have been used for the construction of this property if the Morris family had previous awareness of how plantations functioned in the West Indies? So a global story starts to emerge. And not only that, a story that continues to connect with Indigenous presence throughout this period. I was very excited to see archivally, the Morris-Jumel team was able to unearth archival elements that noted that enslaved members of the kitchen staff were actually going to the market to purchase items from Indigenous peoples who were selling their goods. So this would have been a space where Indigenous presence didn't end with the arrival of colonists and enslaved people. It persisted, and there are spaces on the property where this history can be explored. So in closing out here, what I'd like to emphasize is that we do have pieces or traces of this Indigenous past in the artifacts that exist in the Morris-Jumel's collection. This work was done through cultural resource management and not through explicitly stated academic goals or questions. So if we were trying to target different areas on the property that may indicate the presence of Indigenous peoples, it may be underneath the ground waiting to be discovered. And there are hosts of stories that can similarly be told through material culture. So I hope what I've been able to do tonight is outline the importance of archaeology, not just for protecting cultural heritage in the city, but in helping to illuminate pasts that might be otherwise erased if we don't look to the material record to allow those stories to speak. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here with you tonight, and I'm happy to address any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.
Alrighty. Thank you, Matt. That was fascinating. And I'm just so excited to see what folks have to ask you because I'm sure it's going to inspire some more fascinating info. So if you haven't already, make sure you put your questions in the Q&A portion of the chat. We've got one popped up here already. So this question is there evidence of alterations to the landscape of Upper Manhattan by human inhabitation? Sorry, I just tripped all over that word. Whereby what we would think of a natural environment was modified to accommodate human settlement.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I saw that came from Wayne. So Wayne, thank you again for being here. And thank you so much for connecting me with the folks at the mansion. It's a great question, and I don't have a good answer to it, unfortunately. As I mentioned, I'm relatively new to the world of archaeology from New York City. But excuse me, but there have been extensive excavations throughout northern Manhattan. And that photo I showed of the oyster midden is not a one-off. There were loads of excavations of these sites. And from what we can tell archaeologically, what we're seeing is primarily coastal inhabitation by the Lenape, where lots of those who were living in this region were mining the maritime resources plentifully over the course of thousands of years. But at the same time, as we know, the location of the mansion itself is a pretty strategic zone where you can see both rivers, and it certainly would have been advantageous to those who would have been looking for resources or for the purposes of defense or trade, whatever it may have been. So oftentimes, it's not uncommon for archaeologists to look to coastal settlements because of the assumption of marine resource extraction. But I think a site like Morris-Jumel Mansion is also a strategic space where they would have utilized this space over the course of generations. But in terms of your question of environmental, manipulation or adaptation or change, I don't know of anything extensive, but I'm sure that's the kind of thing that archaeologists would be looking for with continued work.
Alrighty. And then, so thank you for that. The next question is there a single greatest learning or surprise that you've encountered in your work at the mansion? I'm guessing this means with like the artifacts that we've already got sort of that you're examining.
Good question. It's funny. I think the biggest surprise was after being at City College for so many years, I was just totally unfamiliar with the history of the mansion in general. And I think, because City College is in many ways a commuter school, I wasn't alone in thinking this way. My students felt the same, that they had just been shocked by the presence or existence of this space. So I mentioned in the acknowledgments, I taught a course in the fall called The Archaeology of Slavery and Freedom. And we partnered with the mansion where the students came to the mansion multiple times. And I think they were just shocked to see that this historic landscape and structure just existed in northern Manhattan, kind of stone's throw away from our own campus. So I think that's the biggest kind of surprise that many of the students experience, but wouldn't be a surprise to this audience here. I think, personally surprising has been the fact that over the last few years, the mansion has done an incredible job of trying to raise the voices of the Indigenous and Black past of this space. One that in many ways is hard to uncover historically and archivally, but I think the work that's been done really highlights that these stories are there. And I think, for me, I just quickly referenced before I finished that account of an enslaved cook going to the market and purchasing goods from an Indigenous person, selling the food to this cook. Those are the kinds of stories that just don't get amplified to what they deserve. And I think this is the kind of legacy that archaeology can contribute to. As I mentioned earlier, if we can stop thinking about the indigenous period as stopping in 1624, we can start to recognize that those interactions between populations were likely far more common than we previously thought. So I think that's one of the significant kind of aha moments for me. And then that map too, archaeologically, just seeing that these features could be present right under the surface in that park behind the mansion itself today.
Yeah, that is so cool. Do you, just as a little aside, could you walk us through sort of ground penetrating radar and how that works and how we can learn some more about the landscape of the property?
Yeah, absolutely. So I very quickly mentioned it is a non-invasive technique. And it's a process that's been used primarily in the last few years to help discover unmarked graves. You may have been seeing some of these stories popping up, most famously in the last few years, to help communities find the unmarked graves associated with Indigenous boarding schools in the United States and Canada. So it can be really powerful technology, especially for communities that are still mourning and looking for justice. But in this particular context, what's amazing about it, essentially it looks like a big lawnmower device, and you wheel it across the ground, and it sends a signal straight into the ground. And depending on what it hits in terms of obstructions or anomalies, it sends a signal back straight up to the device. And this happens millions and millions of times. And it generates a map that almost looks like, when we used to have static on our TV screens when a channel wasn't coming in clearly. But specialists are able to interpret that and figure out if there are features below the surface. So sometimes a foundation can come out really, really clearly in the data. And this allows archaeologists to hone in their efforts. So rather than digging randomly and trying to find something of archaeological significance, it could help us pinpoint the location of where these features are located. So it's a really significant type of technology. And for the property at Morris-Jumel, this is something that can be done in a single day or an afternoon, given the size. So the technology has advanced so much that we're able to learn a tremendous amount in just a short period of time. And so I had mentioned this to Danielle and Catherine, the director, if there's ever interest at the mansion for doing one of those public Saturdays where we bring in a team to kind of teach the public how this actually works and see what we can find under the surface, it's certainly something that we'd be interested in pursuing.
And that's something that your team at CCNY and CUNY, you all have that equipment, which is super, super cool.
Not me personally.
Not you personally.
Another kind of technology that I'm completely unfamiliar with and how to read it, but I do have very close colleagues and some folks that I've just met. There's an excellent expert in ground penetrating radar and remote sensing at Bronx Community College, and a few other folks on my own campus at City College who specialize in this technology. So a good kind of collaborative project might be possible.
Super cool. So another question that was asked is, what are your recommendations for highlighting the collection related to the excavations of the site?
Yeah, I think, this is a tricky one. And I didn't include a lot of photos from the actual artifacts excavated from Morris-Jumel, and that's primarily because the collection is fairly typical of what you get from a lot of CRM projects around the city. I mentioned the excavations weren't guided by academic questions or trying to learn more about a particular element of the past. It was just to mitigate damage due to construction. So you're very limited by what you find archaeologically, and therefore it's kind of fragments of bricks, chunks of mortar, a lot of construction material. But we did find a lot of tobacco pipes, pieces of ceramic plates. So there are smaller fragments that speak to this kind of personal past and personal history. And so to directly answer the question, I think, we know so much about the people who own the property, the changes that took place because we have the letters that Eliza wrote about the wallpaper that's in the main octagonal room. So we have all those incredible intimate details. But what's amazing about the material culture is that they may not directly be associated with the owners of the property. So tobacco pipes that could have been smoked by enslaved laborers, European migrants who were working in the kitchen or as wage laborers in the post-emancipation period. So I think the artifacts tell a really human and personal story about the majority of people who lived and worked in this space. And the majority of those people were not the owners. They were not the people who we know so much about through the archival record. So even though the artifacts, aren't the most exotic or, flashy things that you might see behind a glass case in a museum, I think they tell a really personal and human story that I think can really be amplified with the right kind of storytelling. So as I talked with the staff, that object-based learning, I think is something that can be improved across the board at historic homes, and certainly something we can work with the mansion to improve as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. That is the stories behind these things are just breathtaking when you really learn about them. So that it sounds really, really cool. Another question that we had is, were there other Lenape groups in the area besides the Lenni Lenape or other native groups, and what similarities or differences did they have?
This one, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to provide an adequate answer. This is still a field that I'm learning a lot more about. The indigenous past in the American Northeast is incredibly complex. You might be familiar with the Onondaga Nation further in upstate New York. So we have political alliances that were forming and dissipating all across generations, and the Lenape were no different. So we know, of course, there's close relationships between those further south and what is now Delaware, New Jersey, into upstate New York, over into Connecticut and Long Island. So there would have been differences in terms of dialect, but there still is a cohesiveness in terms of the Lenape identity that maintains up until the present. And because of European colonization and settler colonialism, the Lenape were largely displaced and scattered across the country, but there still is Lenape presence in the city. And I think that's something, an important point of emphasis that I've mentioned a few times now. And I think these conversations only get stronger when we acknowledge how contemporary communities might think about those differences. And so while I may not know them archaeologically, I think these are still ongoing transformations into the present.
Awesome. So another question we have, I guess this is on the back end of the GPR. What does a GPR machine cost? What is the process sort of in terms of that?
Yeah, so it can vary widely in price. I've used geophysical surveys in Liberia and in Barbados. So when you take travel into West Africa into account, the price tag goes up exponentially. But when companies or faculty members already own the equipment, you're only really dealing with the consulting fees and the processing that's required. So you can get collaborations that are done at just cost. And in some cases, a lot of the collaborators I've worked with over the years, they'll do things at cost with the idea that they'll be able to work to publish the results in an academic journal or have the results publicly accessible and on display. Some of the visuals from this work can be great for museum displays to kind of showcase what's been learned about the property. So in my own experience, if we want to put raw numbers to it and quantify it, we did the work in Liberia and West Africa for multiple days, about a full week of geophysical work, and it was under $10,000. And for a local collaboration, we're talking far less in terms of the cost. So it can vary widely, but thankfully we do have good partners in the CUNY system who would certainly be able to help on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that rolls right into the next question, which is, how can we make more and better connections between, I'm guessing we as an MJF, since this is a question from Wayne, between the Mansion, City College, and other local schools and colleges to bring the history of the mansion and its landscape to life.
Nice.
So
Such an important question. Yeah, I
in
think
between.
there's no, direct answer here, but I think part of it, I was so thrilled that not just through Wayne's connections, but when I first met Catherine and Caroline and you, Danielle, as well, there was just an eagerness to engage. And I think that speaks a lot to what the mission of the mansion, trying to engage with the broader community, and that includes City College. So one thing I noticed, this internship that we started just this past year through archaeology, it'd be great to have a standing internship that could attract students to learn more about the property, but also to share that information with their classmates. I know there's another intern working at the moment named Anna, who also took a couple of anthropology courses. And so those internships, just one by one starts to spread the word. But I also think, having a dedicated connection would allow for field trips for specific courses. We teach lots of courses in the history department, in Dominican studies, in anthropology, across the humanities and social sciences that deal with New York City history and culture. And having that connections to the property would make for an excellent first field trip for students to see this in real life, in their own backyard, so to speak. I think, it's so crucial for city colleges. We have a huge student population from Washington Heights, many of them with Dominican roots. And, being based in Washington Heights, that story of the Dominican Republic is also important to the Morris-Jumel Mansion story. And I think recognizing that connection where it's not closed off gates to the public, it's something that, it's a space that's open, available, and field trips can be the start of that for college courses, but it can further develop into something a little bit more elaborate and sustainable. So for future plans, it's hard to say, but I think, when I first arrived at the mansion, one thing, I kept an open mind, and starting slow and organically. I think the wrong way to approach this would have been for, someone like me to come in and say, well, I have A, B, C ideas, and this is what we should be doing in the next year or two. I think, the best outcomes start with, conversation, brainstorming, and a slow organic process to see what everyone would want to get out of a potential collaboration. So something I'd like to see develop further.
Yeah, and I know that we so adore our interns from City College and we value this collaboration so much. It has really opened the horizon for us. So that's something that as a staff we don't take that for granted for certain, and we're happy that you came in with this idea to sort of start this collaboration. But I digress. But we I have two more questions, and I think that may be all we have time for, especially with the Knicks playing. I want to make sure everybody gets to watch that basketball game. But we have one that says, what do you consider the three most historically significant items found at the mansion site? For our first question.
Oh, I don't have favorites. I remember, years ago when I first started archaeology, a colleague, kind of mentor of mine, said when people would ask him that question, he would always just say George Washington's soup ladle, because it was just believable enough where people were, all right, that seems interesting. But unfortunately, no, that's not something that we found at the property. I briefly referenced earlier the tobacco pipes. Those are really interesting artifacts for me, because they speak to a really interesting social history of a practice that's indigenous in its roots and origins. The smoking of tobacco goes all the way back thousands of years to indigenous North America, but it changes dramatically through the period of colonialism and into the American Republic phase. So many of the tobacco pipes we found were just the stems or pieces of the stems, little fragments. And when colonists first picked up the habit of smoking tobacco, it was a very leisurely, more middle to upper class endeavor, where pipes were purposely constructed with very, very long stems and actually had little resting pieces at the bottom of the bowl where you would rest it on a table. It was a leisurely activity taken advantage of by those who had the means and access. But eventually, it became a practice that was so common amongst laborers, including enslaved Africans, African Americans, and free people of color, that tobacco pipe makers cut down the stem to make it possible to smoke while you were working. So in some cases, workers would just snap off parts of the stem and then chew on the edge to make a little indentation. And we've seen a couple of the pipe stems with marks or scars on the actual stems themselves, but clearly the kind of, pipe that would have been utilized by laborers. And I think that's the kind of history that's often not in the archival record, but one that speaks to that very human experience at the mansion across generations and across thousands of years.
That is so awesome. I'm nerding out on behalf of that person who asked that question. But the other question, which I think is going to be our buzzer beater, not to add a basketball pun into this, is how, if at all, did the mansion's grounds geographical location being high up on the hill affect the type of artifacts that were found there?
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't yet know. And in fact, interestingly, the reports that were written archaeologically indicate that at no time during the excavations did they locate the middens, which are the trash heaps. Now, of course, for during the colonial period, it wasn't uncommon for trash heaps to be located relatively close to the household. But when you're up on that kind of hill and close to two rivers, how close did you want to be to your trash? How for sending laborers down to dump out the trash, were you forcing them to go down to the river, or would it be something that was closer to the house? It's hard to say, but in speaking with Anna, your intern who's currently working, she did reference that there are some archival pieces that indicate that the river was often the dumping ground for the garbage at the mansion. So it's likely that a lot of the trash would have been dumped elsewhere and inaccessible archaeologically, but it still remains possible that there could be midden heaps on the property still there today. So the geographical location of the site could impact what's actually present, but it is a relatively flat area. So there were lots of oyster shells that were found in the excavations, which is not surprising. But it's still, I think, if there were to be excavations in the future, finding those trash heaps would be really telling about the social life of that particular space.
Great. Well, that just about wraps us up today. I think that was so cool. And I think that as such a history nerd, self and proudly proclaimed, finding the trash heaps of the house is kind of on the top of my list too. Just because I would love to see what, one man's trash is another man's treasure, I guess, is exactly what it is. It would be like my treasure. So
Kind of what we live by as archaeologists, so it makes sense.
indeed. But that wraps us up for today. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us. This has been so fun. I look forward to continuing working with you on this project and many more, and to see some of those really cool objects that Matt was talking about. Come see our new exhibition. Him and me worked really, really hard putting these objects, into the limelight and helping us figure out what sort of stories we could tell with the archaeological excavation items that we found in these really cool artifacts. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you all so much for coming and have a great night.
Thank you, everybody.